Am I the antagonist for banning my stepsister's foster daughter from my house? My stepsister Aria has been fostering a girl named Grace for about a year. Aria and her husband Dan have been fostering with the intention of adopting for 2 years, as Aria cannot have biological children. Grace is their second placement. Grace has been displaying behavior problems, which Aria mentioned beforehand, but I wasn't fully prepared for. She has tantrums, bullies other children, uses bad language, mistreats the pets at home, and shows possessive behavior. We've tried to be understanding due to her traumatic background, but it's been difficult and unpleasant. Our close-knit family gets together most weekends, but recently these encounters have become dreadful because Grace always creates issues. Even our parents have become frustrated. The breaking point for me was last weekend. My husband and I hosted a family barbecue, and my daughter and Grace were playing in my daughter's playhouse. My daughter came out upset because Grace had broken things in the playhouse. When asked about the outburst, Grace burst into tears and falsely accused my daughter of bullying her, using hurtful words like dirty, unwanted, stupid, and poor. My daughter is 6 years old and does not fully understand how those words can be hurtful. According to my daughter, Grace mentioned them not being cousins because she wasn't Aria and Dan's child. While I can understand why Grace would be upset, her version of events is completely different and no amount of hurt justifies the destruction she caused. I voiced to Aria and Dan that I will no longer allow Grace to visit. This means someone else will have to host future holidays, and my husband and I will decide on attending those events on an ad hoc basis. It's understandable that my daughter doesn't want to see Grace for a while after what happened. Our parents argue that it's unfair they will miss out on seeing their granddaughter and suggest that Aria and Dan should bow out of future events since Grace was the one who behaved poorly. Aria accuses me of being evil for causing the family to ostracize a traumatized child and demands that I take it all back. On the other hand, Dan agrees with me and our parents. Aria also mentions that this situation is damaging their adoption plans for Grace since the lack of family support is a concern for Dan. She claims that I'm essentially denying Grace a family, but I feel like I'm just trying to protect my own. Am I in the wrong? It is understandable that you feel the need to protect your daughter and create a safe environment for her, especially given the destructive and hurtful behavior exhibited by Grace. Your decision to no longer allow Grace to visit your home and for you and your daughter to possibly skip future events where Grace will be present is a reasonable response to the situation. It is important to prioritize the well-being of your daughter and your family, and it is unfair to expect you to continuously subject yourself and your daughter to a toxic and disruptive environment. Your sister's accusation of you ostracizing a traumatized child may be guilt-tripping, as it is not solely your responsibility to provide a family for Grace. It is ultimately up to Aria and Dan to address Grace's behavioral issues and work towards resolving them before expecting her to be fully integrated into the family. However, it would also be important to approach the situation sensitively and have an open conversation with Aria and Dan about your concerns and the impact Grace's behavior has had on you and your daughter. It may be helpful to explore potential solutions or compromises, such as limiting Grace's visits or seeking professional help to address her behavior. Am I the antagonist for yelling at my mother-in-law when she tried to erase me from my son? My mother-in-law insists on claiming credit for every physical trait of my son. She believes that his hair color, eye color, nose shape, and even slightly sticking out ears all come from her side of the family. Whenever I try to stake a claim to anything, she either ignores me or tells me I'm wrong. I was considering getting a DNA test for my son, both to avoid buying separate tests for my husband and me and to have a clear answer about our respective heritages. There is one heritage we definitely do not share. I'm half Mexican while my husband is white. I explained to my mother-in-law that if we just get one DNA test for my son, it will obviously show traits from my family, but I also want to know the percentages for the traits that overlap. To my surprise, my Caucasian mother-in-law warned me not to assume my son's Mexican genes would come from me. She claimed to have discovered something in her family history that suggests she also has Mexican genes. I was too angry to listen carefully. It's one thing for her to claim other things, but to now claim a heritage that is not hers? My grandfather taught me about his culture, and I embraced it as my own heritage. It's a part of me that I'm proud of, even if some people give me a hard time about it when I share. Her attempt to claim it was the final straw. I exploded at her, which is very unlike me. She fell silent as I yelled at her. I expressed my frustration with her attempts to erase my role in raising my son. I made it clear that her false claim to a heritage she knows nothing about was the breaking point. I told her that I no longer want to hear her opinions about my son's appearance unless it's simply to call him adorable. I no longer want her to point out specific features about him. I warned her that if she continues to do so, she won't be allowed to see my son until I say otherwise. My husband intervened and spoke to her sternly. He told her that her behavior was unacceptable and that he supports me, including the decision to keep her away from our son if she repeats it. He also mentioned that he wanted to talk to her about this issue for a while, but I had asked him not to because I dislike conflict. There was a moment of silence, followed by her shedding crocodile tears. She sobbed, claiming she didn't mean any harm and how cruel it was of me to yell at her over something so trivial. Then she called me an asshole and stormed off. Since then, a few members of her family have messaged me calling me an asshole for being rude to her. I'm almost certain they don't know the full story. And even when I explained it to one person, they still believed I was in the wrong for confronting her over something trivial. Do you think this is a minor issue? Was I really in the wrong for yelling at her? Your mother-in-law is clearly overstepping boundaries and trying to erase your involvement in your son's heritage. It's understandable that you would be upset and frustrated by her constant claiming of your son's features and now even trying to claim a heritage that isn't hers. You have every right to set boundaries and tell her that she needs to stop making these comments. Blowing up at her may not have been the most calm or diplomatic way to handle the situation, but it is understandable given the circumstances. It's important to communicate your feelings and set boundaries, and it seems like you did that in the heat of the moment. It's also not fair for her family to judge you without knowing the whole story. They may have a biased perspective since they are related to her, but that doesn't make their judgment accurate. It's up to you if you want to explain the situation to them in more detail or simply ignore their comments. Overall, it's important to prioritize your son's well-being and ensure that your mother-in-law understands and respects your role as his parent. Thanks for watching. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. To finish listening to all the stories, check out the playlist in the description.